yet in the New World, but delicious native pecans grew abundantly across Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico. So what happened? Spanish cooks in Mexico, Mexican cooks in Texas, and French cooks in New Orleans all adapted to what was available, and they began making their caramelized sugar candies with pecans instead of almonds. The New Orleans candies were called pralines, just as they were in France. But in Mexico, as far as I've been able to find out, they were never called pralines or pralines. They went by a variety of other names, such as jamoncillos, nugado, and dulce de piloncillo. On the Texas-Mexican border, they were known simply as dulce de nuez, which means nut candy. Did I skip on? No. From very early days, a cottage industry was available to poor people in Texas as well as in Mexico and Louisiana, and that was making this pecan candy and selling it on the street. Pecans were free for the picking, so the only investment required was a pot, a source of heat, and some sugar. The typical sugar choice was piloncillo, those cones of unrefined brown sugar that we saw earlier. By the 1870s, street vendors of Mexican-style pecan candy were well documented in South Texas, particularly on the streets of San Antonio. Many early descriptions placed the candy sellers in Military Plaza, one of the locations where the famous chili queens set up their popular outdoor Mexican food stands. This is a very early photo of Military Plaza, and you can clearly see one of the chili stands in the lower left corner. These makeshift outdoor restaurants, the chili stands, remained an important part of San Antonio culture until the 1940s. They were popular with all levels of society: cowboys, families, soldiers, politicians, tourists, and gas women. Everyone rubbed shoulders at the chili stands. There were places where the social rules were suspended, and the scene was wildly romanticized in city histories and stories. One of O. Henry's strangest tales is set at a San Antonio chili stand where a young man has hallucinations induced by eating hot peppers. On this slide, this is a 1902 photo and
I'm going to interrupt, I'm sorry. I'm getting messages that folks are not seeing the screen share. Are we still having, is anyone still having trouble seeing the PowerPoint?
I see it.
I'm seeing it okay too. Okay. I see your, okay. It sounds like others are able to see it. So we're good. Okay, sorry to interrupt, MM.
Okay, so I don't need to go back and show. Okay.
I don't think so. No, I think we're good. I think we just had maybe an internet connection error somebody had or something. So we're good to go. Thank you.
I was about to say that here's a 1902 photo and a 1911 illustrated newspaper piece about the chili queens. Interestingly, none of the accounts I've found say that the chili stands sold candy. There were descriptions of tamales, of chili, beans, tortillas, coffee, and hot chocolate, but I found no mention of any candies at the chili stands. So who was selling the candy? This is the earliest photo of a San Antonio candy vendor that I found, and it's from 1870. It's hard to see here, but when you magnify his tray, the front rows are clearly the equivalent of Louisiana pralines, flat brown discs studded with pecans. And here's the only photographic record I know of that actually shows a candy vendor in proximity to the chili stands. But he is there. And I think we can surmise from this that diners probably bought their dessert from nearby candy sellers. And here are a few photos and postcards from San Antonio that show Mexican candy sellers in different decades. So have you noticed a theme running through these photos? All the candy vendors are men. I haven't found any description or illustration of women selling candy on the street in San Antonio. Here's a very typical description from a 1934 newspaper. Quote, "The Mexican candy man standing patiently for hours behind a little tray of piloncillo cakes with pecans was a familiar and characteristic figure on the streets." So this is a marked difference from the illustrations of the female praliniers of New Orleans, and also from the San Antonio chili queens who were running the outdoor restaurants nearby. I don't know why Mexican candy vendors all seem to be men. Did the men also make the candy? I haven't found any answers to that, but my suspicion is that they did not, but I don't know. That remains to be found someday, I hope. I mentioned earlier that in the mid-20th century, pecan candy was once the most common dessert in Texas Mexican restaurants. So the next question is, when did the Mexican nut candy migrate from street vendors into restaurants? There are records as early as 1883 of indoor Mexican restaurants in the Tejano neighborhoods of San Antonio. However, in 1899, an immigrant from Chicago named O.M. Farnsworth opened a restaurant in downtown San Antonio that he called the original Mexican restaurant. Obviously, it was not the original Mexican restaurant, but it was the first restaurant outside the barrios to serve Mexican food, specifically marketed to Anglo patrons. This advertisement for the San Antonio Palace of Sweets is from sometime between 1915 and 1920, and it offers, quote, Mexican candies made by white people only. Sadly, you get the idea. In direct opposition to the egalitarian chili stands, the message here was you could enjoy traditional Mexican candy, just not touched by Mexican hands. And the Palace of Sweets certainly was not the originator of Mexican candies, as they claim here. But the success of the original Mexican restaurant set the precedent for the proliferation of Tex-Mex restaurants all over the state throughout the 20th century. These places were owned by both Anglos and Mexican Americans, but they catered primarily to non-Mexican diners. And sometime between 1899 and the 1940s, Mexican candy made the short and logical leap from street vendors near outdoor chili stands to being sold at the cash registers of Mexican restaurants to an official place on the restaurant menus. And so the next question is, why and when did Texans begin using the New Orleans French word praline to describe Mexican pecan candy, even though we pronounce it praline? When I first started working on this topic, my hypothesis was that the terminology change probably happened after World War II, when many Louisianans migrated to Texas to work in the oil business. But it turns out I was wrong. It was in use much earlier than that. I don't have a definitive answer, but one clue comes from El Phoenix Cafe. The first Mexican restaurant opened in Dallas in 1918 by Miguel Martinez, that is still being operated today by his descendants. Here are two menus from El Phoenix. On the left is a 1937 menu that says ice cream or candy for dessert. The menu on the right is undated, but based on the prices, I believe it's from the 1940s. The desserts offered are ice cream or Mexican praline. So candy became praline on this restaurant's menu between 1937 and sometime in the 1940s. And this is the earliest usage of the term Mexican praline on a menu that I've found yet. But what about cookbooks? There were only a few Texas-centric cookbooks published before the 20th century. Some contained recipes for candies called pralines, but I haven't found any Texas cookbook references to specifically Mexican pralines until 1965. However, in a 1930 San Antonio newspaper, I found the term Mexican praline pie. So as early as 1930, someone was making the connection between Mexican candy and the name praline, even if it didn't show up in a cookbook and for 35 more years. Old newspaper archives get digitized all the time. So recently I did a new online search for the term Mexican praline and I got a shock. In this 1914 newspaper ad from Racine, Wisconsin, we have Mexican praline ice cream that was, quote, exactly the same flavor as the famous pecan nut praline sold on the plazas in Mexico. So in 1914, 16 years earlier than any reference I've found in any Texas sources, an ice cream manufacturer in Wisconsin connected Mexican candy and the word praline. What this tells me is that I need to keep on looking for earlier Texas sources of the term, because if someone made the connection in Wisconsin, I'm pretty sure they did in Texas too. And just to show that what goes around comes around, here's a 2009 ad from Bluebell Ice Cream Company in Brenham. They offer a, quote, new flavor Mexican praline ice cream, just like that one in Wisconsin almost 100 years earlier. The current Bluebell flavor is simply called pecan pralines and cream, but I suspect it's pretty similar to Mexican praline. It's pretty good. So about all I can say with total certainty is that it's absolutely common in Texas today to refer to Mexican tradition pecan candy as pralines, and that they are culinary cousins to New Orleans pralines. These two traditions have a common root in medieval Persia that migrated across Europe and into Mexico and New Orleans, and eventually these two paths converged in Texas. Pralines are found in restaurants, in gas stations, airports, catalogs, candy shops, in cookbooks, and all over the internet. If you Google the term Mexican praline recipe, you'll get more than 8 million hits. Seriously. And in one of these online recipes, I found a pretty good quote that sums up this cultural mashup. Quote, nothing completes a meal of delicious Mexican cuisine like a praline. I hope that all this talk about Texas pralines might inspire you to make some of your own and think about their long journey into Texas kitchens and cookbooks. Recipes definitely have evolved since the early days of simply sugar, pecans, and water. You can find recipes that include milk, cream, buttermilk, vanilla, corn syrup, salt, and baking soda. And of course, there's an endless debate about crunchy versus chewy styles. But they're all recognizable as pralines, and they all descended from the early versions. I'm sharing one of my favorite recipes that comes from the late Austin restaurateur Matt Martinez of Matt's El Rancho Restaurant. You can find it in his book titled Mex-Tex, Traditional Tex-Mex Taste, and the recipe is also available online. Not only is it absolutely delicious, but it's pretty simple and it tells you how to make it without a candy thermometer. Here's the recipe plus some pralines that I made last week from it. Just a couple of tips. for best result, and this applies, I think, to any praline making. You use a heavy bottom pot and a wooden spoon to stir. Have all your ingredients ready and measured before you start, because things move fast once they start moving. And avoid making pralines on a damp or humid day. I like to toast the pecans before starting, just for some extra crunch. It may take you a few tries to get a feel for when the syrup is stiff enough to dip out and harden. And this is the softball stage if you are a candy maker. But about the worst thing that can happen is that even if pralines don't set, you'll still have some really delicious topping for ice cream or pound cake. And just remember those early Texas folks with a little fire, a pot, some rough sugar, and pecans that they gathered from native Texas trees. Okay, that's what I got.
Thank you so much, That I certainly learned a lot. And we've gotten some good questions too that I'll go ahead and dive into. The first question we got is sugar also grown in Mexico?
Yes. I think it's mostly along the coast now, but yes. And I mentioned that Hernan Cortez brought sugar to Mexico City and established the first sugarcane mill there. And that was, I think, 1535. So sugar has been growing in Mexico for a long time. I don't know that it's a huge commercial crop, but it does grow there.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of comments when you were talking about the male candy, the candy vendors all being men. Deborah says men may have sold, women could have been at home making the candy, but women were also at home taking care of children. Someone said, I wonder if it is because the women are at home making the candy. Lots of love for El Phoenix. I'll mention that as a Texas treasure restaurant too, one of the recognized by the THC as a historic Texas restaurant.
I totally agree with that comment, and that's what I would guess too, is the women were at home making candy and the men were out selling it. I just thought it was interesting that it wasn't, I mean, the chili queens were running the chili stands, but somehow women, and I'm not saying there never were any women selling candy on the street. I just haven't found any photographic or documented evidence of it.
Deborah said, I wonder if World War II and the shortages, rationing of sugar in the US had any impact on the availability and sale of pralines.
That's a good question, and I would guess yes, because sugar shortages affected everything. Sugar was rationed, and so people were very careful with it and save desserts for special occasions. So I think the answer to that is yes. There was probably a dearth of pralines during the war.
How similar are Stephanie asks this question, good question. How similar are the recipes you found in Texas, Mexico, and New Orleans? Are there any distinctions?
They're all pretty similar in the early days. As people got more sophisticated and had more access to other ingredients, you see, the ingredients like butter and buttermilk and milk. I think if I were to make a generalization, the New Orleans style pralines are generally on the chewier side, and the Texas style pralines and Mexican are a little, crunchier, harder. And I read a quote when I was looking at recipes. T. Adelaide Brennan of Brennan's Restaurant said, and they are famous for their New Orleans style pralines. And she said, there's the Brennan's way to make pralines, and there's the wrong way to make pralines. And Brennan's recipe has corn syrup in it, which tends to make pralines chewier. And corn syrup wasn't readily available until I think around World War II. So that's a newer development. So I can't really say whether recipes, I mean, if you look at those 8 million hits of recipes, there are not that many what am I trying to say? Not that many variations. You see similarities. I mean, there are ingredients substituted in, but basically they're the crunchy and the chewy, and buttermilk adds a tang, but they're all similar. You can tell that they all came from the same roots. I hope that answered the question.
I think so, absolutely. Let's see. Deborah says, my sister-in-law's family has owned a Mexican restaurant started in Houston many years ago. Her father was originally from Mexico and then immigrated to Texas. I'm going to ask her if her family has any background of the use of the term Mexican praline. Please do, and report back to us. Love to hear
no, my family doesn't. I grew up on the east side of Houston, and we would eat Mexican food on Friday nights at the Monterey House Mexican restaurant, which was all over the Houston area. And they made a Mexican candy that they would tuck into the basket of chips that was more of a leche quemada, more of a milk sugar candy. And then you could buy pralines at the cash register when you left. But other than that, my family doesn't have a history of praline making. We just liked them.
Jillian says, mine always crumble too much. I think I'm going past the hardball stage. Any tips?
I'm not an expert, but I think that's right, because things I have read are if they don't, okay, there's two reasons they don't set. And one of them is it's a damp day. And trust me, I have learned this the hard way. And the other is that you haven't stirred it enough. And so enough of the moisture hasn't come out of the sugar syrup. But the other thing I've read is that if you cook it too long, it'll start to crumble. I'm sure there are people out there who know way more about candy making than I do, but those are things I've read. So I would say, just stop a little sooner than you've been doing.
Mm-hmm. Bobby asked how much milk. The fraction is not distinct on the screen. Maybe the recipe that you shared, do you recall? Did it have?
Let me see. I'm sorry about that. That isn't a very good picture, but I was taking the photo from the book and I couldn't get it to lie flat. Let me see. 2 cups sugar, 1/4 cup of milk.
Thank you.
And you have a link that you can post that recipe if you want.
And I'll include it in an email to all registrants as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I can include a link in our follow-up email. Let's see. Jolene asks, what part of France was the Duke from?
I don't know the answer to that. I would say he at least kept a house in Paris because he was a Duke and, had dealings with the palace and the royalty, but where his family homelands are, I'm sorry, I don't know. I think that's find outable. I just don't know the answer.
Good question. Thank you.
But they were making the sugar almond candies pretty much all over France. Earliest in the south, but it moved north.
Jolene asks, is date nut loaf related to pralines?
I guess I'm not familiar with date nut loaf, so I don't know.
Neither am I. Neither am I. Kathleen shares, Aunt Aggie in Seguin has a business for years, often found in local restaurants in South Texas. Thanks for sharing, Kathleen. Let's see. Jolene, on slide number 2, there were 2 stars in Illinois. What did they mark?
That they didn't mark anything. That was just a blank map that I used to draw the so sorry about that, but those stars were immaterial to what we were talking about.
Good question though. Are there any recipes for the Persian / almond candy?
Yes, there are a number of, I guess I would say, and Persian cookbooks from very early days, from like 10th century forward, that clearly show the almond and caramelized sugar candies. And I suspect in modern Persian cookbooks, there would be some too, because it's an old tradition, and it's and when you look in Spain, in Italy, in Provence, in southern France, there are candy making traditions that clearly are related, that came from the same root as it was passing on from Persia to North Africa to Southern Europe.
Someone commented or suggested, could the Germans of Texas have moved the pralines up north to the Germans in Wisconsin? Reason for the ice cream ad.
That is a very good point that had not occurred to me, but that certainly could explain it. I know that certainly there were communications among German communities all over the country. And pecans, they went up the Mississippi River Valley. So I don't know that they grew as far north as Wisconsin, but they weren't far. But I love that idea of the Texan Germans and Wisconsin Germans communicating about the candy. I'm gonna follow up on that and see if I can find anything more. Thank you so much for thinking of that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Lots of comments from people who've really enjoyed the presentation, and learned a lot. Just wanted to make sure you saw those comments too.
I wasn't looking at the comments. I thought it would distract me, but I can do that. But thank you all.
I think we got a couple more questions here. Is the candy called Patience similar to Texas pralines? I'm not familiar.
I'm not either. What is it?
Please share more.
Yeah, please do.
Co-making is who that came from. I mean, I don't have a name, so whoever shared that question, please elaborate. Let's see, what other questions we have? Helen says, the New Orleans pralines are made in a humid environment, so probably more chewy. Texas is more crunchy since they're less humid, except in Houston. Good point, Helen. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. And that may have everything to do with how the two styles developed. I know the introduction of corn syrup is a factor, but it's certainly not the only factor. But yeah, the humidity means you're going to have chewier pralines.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marie and Aaron, for sharing your memories of pralines. Marie says, my introduction to pralines was in the original Mexican cafe in Galveston in the 1950s, and they were sold at the cash register and were crunchy and smooth, a child's delight. I love that. Aaron says, I grew up in Northeast Houston, and we went to Monterey House also. Always looked forward to those candies in the bottom of the chip bowl.
Absolutely. You ate the chips to get down to the candy.
I have a memory too of that somewhere. I don't know what restaurant that would have been at, but that rings a bell. Deborah asks you, how do you get to be a food historian? Such a great field.
Whoa. I don't know that there's any official or even common path to get there. I my background was in I was an English major, and then I got a degree in library science. So my background was in research and literature, and then I worked in high tech. But all the time I was I don't know, cooking for friends, giving parties, and my midlife crisis was I ran away to culinary school and quit my high-tech job. And while in culinary school, I was exposed to some writers who were doing food history. And it made such an impression on me. And I thought, oh, this is the most interesting part of food that I have run across yet. And, the snowball just kept rolling. So when I wrote for several publications, just doing food writing, like the Austin Chronicle is a good example. And I started practicing what I called stealth food history, in that I was whatever I was writing about, I would try to introduce some context, some background about that topic. And, I just gradually took over as the parts that were the most interesting to me. And I love all the stories that everyone has about how food migrates from one part of the world to another, what happens when it gets there, when people have to work with unfamiliar ingredients so they adapt, when food traditions rub shoulders in a city somewhere where immigrants come from different places and they share ingredients and their recipes morph and change. I think you practice food history just by starting to do it. I don't really have a better answer than that. I don't think anyone offers a degree. There's food studies degrees, but that's, I think, as close as I know about.
We had an intern this summer who mentioned having recently learned about a food history program, like a degree program at some school. I think that she'd come across. So I might be brand new, but I think it's becoming more of a thing.
I'm glad to hear that, and I'll look into that. There are scholars and academics all over the country in universities everywhere that are doing food history, and that's their top, some piece of that is their topic, and they teach it and they write about it. But this is the first I've heard that there was actually a program. They're often in history department or American studies departments or things like that. And I just saw a note about patience. And it looks pretty similar. That's not a name that I'm familiar with. And I bet that comes from a specific part of the country, but I just learned something.
I also want to clarify, Aunt Aggie in Sinton, not in Seguin. Sinton, not in Seguin.
Okay.
So, shout out to Aunt Aggie. I wanted to correct what I had said earlier.
Well, Sinton's further south, right?
I would have to look at a map.
I think it is. It's on the coastal bend, I believe.
Worth looking up, it sounds like, to find Aunt Aggie, though. Deborah says, you might be interested. My mother was Cajun, French speaking originally. She grew up with Paul Prudhomme. He spoke about how foods evolve. She swore no Cajun ever made blackened fish or any other blackened foods, but that Paul burned the spices and served it anyway.
I've heard that story too. Well, Paul Prudhomme was a chef, and so chefs take liberties. And so I wouldn't be surprised if I don't know that I've ever heard of blackened anything before him. But I don't know if he made pralines either. Pralines. It would be pralines in Louisiana.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's all the questions we have from folks. So thank you. This has been a really great presentation and a fun conversation. And we'll send the recording to everybody and with a link to the recipe that MM shared as well. Is there anything else you wanted to share, MM? Any last minute questions before we sign off and let people get to cooking?
I'm just so happy that so many people were interested in this topic. That just warms my heart. So thank you all so much for coming. And, I guess the takeaway I'd love is when you're making your own pralines or even eating one in a restaurant, think about how they got here. And that's food history.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, MM. Take care, everybody. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. I hope you'll join us again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.